Hi, good afternoon, everyone. So here we have, as Arthur mentioned, there's a lot of different lay people not understanding the technical terms of science. So I would like to briefly set the tone of this panel is to bridge the different research science translational gaps to the entrepreneurial society. So if I could just get everyone to briefly introduce themselves, that would be great to kickstart the panel.
Thank you, Sakeena. Hi, my name is Sang. I'm the managing director of Temasek Life Sciences Accelerator. What we do is basically we try to commercialize a lot of the research that mainly originates from our parent organization, Temasek Life Sciences. And it usually covers things such as aquaculture, bio-life science, cancer diagnostics, among other things. The research team is quite large. It has been around for 20 plus years. And we have roughly 50 areas of research at any given point in time. And hopefully we get to see something interesting that we can bring to the market.
Hey, I'm Kadri. That was pretty loud, I guess. I'm a CEO of Triumf Health. That's a company that creates a psychological support for ill children through a game environment. And at the same time, I'm doing my research at the University of Helsinki, so I'm in between the science and entrepreneurship, and really happy to contribute to the discussion.
Hello, everyone. I hope you can hear us despite all the background noise. My name is Julien. I'm working with a European VC called Idinvest, and we support scientists who basically want to start their companies. We do it in Europe, we do it in China, we do it in Singapore, and we do it in the US too.
So for just everyone's generic view, Sang is going to represent sort of like the local scene of how investors look at as a government-backed fund, and Kadri here will take part as the academic/researcher angle of a scientist and entrepreneur and share her perspectives, and Julien, of course, the investor that would share how people they can value deep tech and how the different aspiring scientists and entrepreneurs can sort of check off a certain kind of benchmark of what they can look out for in order to make their technology more understandable to the layperson and turn into a startup or entrepreneurship. So I will kick off the panel with a generic question. So has the problem point of bridging this translational gap between research science and entrepreneurship ever occurred to you guys? And what's the big problem that you guys are trying to solve? So perhaps...
Well, since I'm now in the middle of these issues, then I can start. And in my case, it actually started when I was doing clinical work at the hospital. And then at the same time, I started doing my PhD. And then I already realized how far research and clinical work is. My background is in psychology. So this was the first time that I saw the gap. And this wasn't even between the business and research. And then a couple of years in the PhD, when I decided that I would just do research and focus on one issue, then I gradually saw how further and further and further from the clinical work it goes. And then I started working or established a startup to offer psychological support to children through a game, through a digital tool to reach out to more children that I would be able to as a clinical psychologist doing one-on-one meetings. So the gap has been large, like both ways, both like between the clinical work, the research, and then the business as well. So gaps everywhere.
If I could add to that, I mean, it's a very good insight. And it actually reflects the challenges of the work that we do. I mean, we all hear stories about how doing startups is hard. But if you go a bit earlier in a startup's life cycle, going to the stages of research and ideation and all that, that's even more difficult. And what we often see is that there is kind of an unspoken conflict where you have to decide, is this a situation where we have this issue because the scientist doesn't know enough about the market? Or is it the other way around where the market is a bit challenged about what the science can do? And often I see that these kind of situations can be resolved if there is a bridge, usually embodied in maybe a very cross-disciplinary entrepreneur or an administrator or a scientist who might be very good with numbers. And aside from those situations, it's very difficult to deal with these kind of I would say, challenges. So to add to that, if I were to describe how we try to bridge the gap and address some of the questions that we have, our organization is looking right now at things related to food safety and food security. That's a very big topic here in Singapore. And these kind of things have touch points with life science and biotech as well. And I would like to say that although all these industries are different, same challenge. Scientist realm, commercial realm, not much overlap.
A lot of very good points. I think to illustrate the problem, if I look at the crowd who's listening to us today, if I could get a hand count for you out there, how many people out there are entrepreneurs? There's 1, 2. Anyone else? There's only 2 entrepreneurs right now listening to us. Okay. Out of you 2, are you both? Do any of you guys have a science background? And are you a scientist? No. One and the other. Are you a scientist by trade? No, it doesn't seem. So that's the issue. Yeah, we can see it right now. So the issue is, who out of the scientist community wants to come out of a lab to Slush, right? Who's willing to come and just hustle out there? There's a lot of discomfort in starting companies. It's tough. We know that, and that's one of the biggest issues. There's a disconnect. So for us who are financing the entrepreneurs, we actually tend to finance scientists who will come out here. So we think it's a good show if they're willing to come out here, raise capital, be competitive with other founders working on other technologies. That's a very big premium. If they don't want to do that, for us, it sends us a lot of negative signals on their ability to grow the company.
On that note, when you were speaking about them getting out of the labs, right, I was thinking that because a lot of them are based in academia or research, their main focus would probably be in churning more journals and like getting more like hits on what can be their next protocol of funding their next project. So what is one of the like ideas or solutions that we can probably move towards on the different perspectives, especially with Sang knowing like how the landscape and the different startups are like with the researchers? How is they then like helping these people to like get out of the labs better?
You bring up a very important point about, and this builds on what Julien and Kadri said as well. Yes, to be fair to the scientists, if they don't want to leave their labs and focus on their research work, they're actually doing what was required of them, which is to deliver world-class, best-of-its-kind research. What has to change is how they're recognized as well as how they're incentivized going forward. And that's probably a change that has to happen maybe at the lab level that is a little bit above so-called their pay grade. So what does that mean in the context of switching directions for lab researchers? Instead of focusing on the number of papers they have to deliver, where they are, for instance, graded on which journals they get cited in or which journals publishes them, maybe they have to add on an additional component of whether there is 1 or 2 cases of commercialization, or there are other 2 cases of where it has some kind of licensing with a numeric number that is attached as a little bit of a KPI. And these things should not be just grouped under some kind of financial goal. That's not the idea. It's just to nudge the scientists enough in a direction so they feel that not only does their work continue to mean something to them in their old standards, but also in the way that they're doing something that affects areas that they hadn't considered before. My work is benefiting the organization. It is helping some people, and I can see some of the numeric benefits from that. And I think nowadays it's very fashionable to classify that under the term of impact. It's an overused word, but it does capture the right essence.
A lot of good points. The one I would add for everyone who's thinking about going from science to entrepreneurship, one of the things that we've seen is that we work in the US, we work in Europe, and we work in Asia. It's very different. In the US, university teachers are very often entrepreneurs, and they also sometimes set up their own funds. So the connect between both universes is pretty good. But in Europe, in Europe, and it's actually quite different. As a pure scientist working in a university environment, you get a lot of, let's say, you're very recognized as such. You don't need to be an entrepreneur on top of that. It's not necessarily well researched. So in Europe, actually, it's when we actually have scientists or doctors who actually set up companies that are very successful, who become socially very successful. Let's take an example. In France, the company called Carmat, which is basically doing heart replacement right now. So they replace hearts with engineered hearts. The company now is I think it's listed or is listing, and it's just getting a lot of media attention. The guys at the top of Carmat, they have to go out in the world and explain what they're doing. So they're not just scientists or doctors; they're also entrepreneurs. The more French universities, Belgian universities, German universities you have such figures, the more it becomes appealing for. So that's something we've seen. In China, it's a little bit like in the U.S. The connect is pretty good, but more importantly, in China, what we're seeing is the scientists are just getting so much money for the projects that they're immediately incentivized to participate as an entrepreneur. So it's a little bit of a different situation.
Yeah, I just wanted to add regarding the differences between the academia and the startup scene, for example, that the time perception is very different, for example, on how the academia has such a strong background, like so theoretical, and you take time to work on your hypotheses, your research questions. You don't really involve that much users or patients. In my case, for example, you generalize your findings, and then it's always good to find some trends and so on. But as you turn into clinical work, then you see that every single person is unique and individual. And regarding the psychological therapy, for example, what works for one doesn't work for another, and then that's why there is this one question also, the gap between like clinical and research part, for example, that it has to really be like everyone needs to take this step like towards each other. The science, it cannot be for close members that one researcher is doing research for another and then they cite each other and then at one point they might collaborate, but the aim should be to give this new knowledge to the society, to clinicians, to entrepreneurs, and so on. And it has to be in a language that is also understandable. And yeah, and from the clinician's perspective, I think that there is a big engagement into science, and people really want to know more about that. And from the entrepreneurial part as well, or from the startup perspective, it's always valuable to validate your solutions, to do research based on what you have. And just the science cannot be that closed society between researchers.
So on the note of, there was once, I saw a question that was regarding how can then the startups, how can then the scientists turn more into entrepreneurs? So Sang, you mentioned earlier that it can be included in their so-called curriculum, that there can be a KPI of like commercializing. Then how about from the investor side of things? Can the gap be like lessened from how can these startups then know what are the different sort of like benchmarks to meet for reaching out to investors? How can they be more open to such opportunities?
So one of the good news for people who are interested in pure science is that some of the most valuable companies that are being founded out there today actually come from very, very high science. So if we look at companies we've invested in, we have 4 NASDAQ IPOs. 2 of them are in biotech, and there's a lot of biotech. So that in itself, very successful, very high quality science, being listed, entrepreneurs making a lot of money also. Believe it or not, is that have scientist background is also very, very important. So I would say to basically accelerate the movement. Scientists, doctors, setting up very successful companies, becoming very acknowledged for the science, but also getting a profit for it has been very, very valuable. So that is one thing I have to highlight. The others is that this for investors in biotech, this path already exists. Biotech allows you at every stage as you're progressing to demonstrate that you're getting closer and to get investors to finance. And that's what's very unique about biotech. What we're trying to do with quote unquote deep tech is replicate what we've been able to do in biotech in other sectors. How do we, for someone who's doing AI, finance him as he is progressing on the science, even though he doesn't yet have a commercial model? So that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to do what biotech was very successful in other areas of science.
And that's actually a excellent development, because assuming you get to a certain point, surviving maybe the initial challenge of growing your business as a scientist who's become an entrepreneur, there are all these support structures that you can count on. Investors who know what they're doing, things applying all these insights that have worked before. But going back to this original question, I want to add one point. From where I sit in a research organization, I want to sort of highlight the fact that there's no need for a researcher to suddenly one day wake up and say, I'm going to stop being a physician, I'm going to stop my studies that I spent 8 years of my life getting toward, and from this day onward, I'm going to become an entrepreneur. That kind of mindset seems very fashionable and popular, but that's not necessary. What's important more is that whatever you do, if you have a keen interest that is outside your scientific, let's say, expert or your domain expertise, nothing stops you from trying to find out more about how other companies have started. As Julien pointed out, there have been many cases of scientists who have always started from maybe one idea, and they were able to benefit from maybe talking to other people, other entrepreneurs, administrators, people like us, who have either guided them and allowed them to take maybe the first minimal next stage. Nobody's forcing you to take a major leap so you can say that you're an entrepreneur. And that is probably the initial barrier for some of these scientists to consider something outside of their work. And it is a missed opportunity. If you see something, maybe you want to bring probiotics into beer, and your research had to do with fermentation, and you wanted to do that in the context of helping people. Maybe alcoholics might recover better if they drink beer, which is actually very bad, but maybe it will help them accelerate their recovery process. Whatever that might be, you don't need to do that business overnight next day. You can take small measured steps until you get to a point where you can start running. Somehow, people sort of think that, no, I have to run from my first step. That's not the expectation. And if you have that in mind, if you can remember that, then maybe the question that you ask is something that's easier to answer.
Yeah, absolutely great points. I just wanted to add that like in my head, I always wanted to become a professor, and I wanted to have an academic career, and that was it. Like I had my goal set, and it's if you become an entrepreneur, then you in the beginning you do what you know. You can apply for research grants as well, for example. This is what you can do, and you need to just have the mindset of, like, if you go to the landing page of Slush, there is this sentence that we don't want you to learn something, we want you to change something. And if you have this kind of mindset, then entrepreneurship is really something to consider, and you can do this based on the skills that you have gained as a researcher. But also I think that it's not necessary for the leader of the team to be researcher, if it's research-based solution, for example, but you still have someone in the team fully who has research background. Just to have a scientific advisor, in my opinion, is not enough. So if you really want to go into this deep tech, that is this buzzword going on. So it's as a researcher, just to answer again to the question, just you start from what you know, and you can apply this in entrepreneurship. And for example, the startup that I'm leading, we were the first startup in Estonia to get research funding. So I'm actually doing my postdoc. I'm my own employer, and I'm the employee as well in my company. So that's doable. And think about it, it's wonderful.
Just want to share one story that I think is also interesting. You know, we've backed entrepreneurs that are very strong in maths because they've been doing AI and a lot of algorithms. When it came to discussing a cap table and how to do refinancing, there's some basic mathematical involved in the finance. The entrepreneurs just came up with some of the most complex structures that I've ever seen in a waterfall. He blew my mind in many ways. So these are entrepreneurs that come from pure science backgrounds, math. They're not necessarily dedicated to what we're doing, but when they become entrepreneurs, their skills follow through, and sometimes it gives them also huge advantages as entrepreneurs. So just saying.
On a separate note, right, on looking at how can scientific research be commercialized at scale in the Southeast Asian market, I was just wondering, because a lot of scientific research, it's stuck in the optimization phase. Like, there's a lot of different continual findings of improving the technology, how can then they be funded on and supported in this process? It's more towards Sang.
I'll try to keep this short. I think it's an important question to ask, but the answer to that, unfortunately, is a very undesirable answer. Science cannot be scaled. I think that's almost like expecting us to have Nobel Prize level research done every single day and we can somehow push that out and achieve like hundreds of those every year. It doesn't. What we have to value is that we have to benefit from a diverse effort in looking at everything that is interesting in a specific area. For instance, if we look at things such as cancer diagnostic, only now are we bringing on to bear the power of things like machine learning, pattern matching, neural networks, capsule networks, all these terms which come in to do this. It's wonderful, but at the same time, it should not be focused on purely at the expense of all the decades of research that have been expended on pure cancer research, all the hard insights that have been gained, right? Now, if that kind of effort has been already there for decades, why haven't we seen tens or dozens of breakthrough outcome where cancer has been obliterated? And it goes to maybe reflect two things. Cancer is not easy to deal with, and maybe two, that kind of research trying to get to some kind of outcome might take a few more years or maybe a few more decades. What's important here is that, yes, it's going to take longer, but let's still spend time and money on it, and let's try to add deep tech to it and try to get to something faster. That's the ideal one should have. One should not try to think that, okay, next year I'm going to scale research here in Southeast Asia and scale research in South America and then US by a factor of 750%. And then I'm going to put in $25 billion behind it. I wish we were living in a world like that, but we aren't. And that's my view.
I'll just briefly add on that. I agree, with what Sang is saying. Putting money behind science just alone doesn't work. But I do think that I work between Singapore and Beijing, and I do think that Singapore or Israel, when you do lack resources, natural resources, when your main resources in people's brains is their mind, these two places are putting a lot of emphasis on growing, these technologies because they don't have necessarily other resources that they want to put. So if you are very, very small, it brings that value. You're trying to stay ahead, create high value products, but with limited resources, which beyond your scientists. So I think that's one interesting point. Why in Southeast Asia it is developing a lot in Singapore and maybe more than other areas, but that's not enough. The other thing I was going to say is if you look at Israel, they have US as a market, and Singapore can be fortunate to potentially have both India and China as markets. So to scale it up in Southeast Asia, it's not just great to have an important community of scientists, but you do need a very deep market to scale this. And that's where I think Singapore can be really, really instrumental, to be a cluster with a lot of knowledgeable scientists, but have a very, very, very deep application market in both India and China, just like Israel has with Europe, but also mostly with the US.
So I think that we've put two money perspectives on this issue. We'd like to conclude the panel by asking Kadri, what then can there be more concrete steps in terms of actionables and moving forward from a more researcher, academic point of view that turned entrepreneur, that they can then get out of the labs and then translate this entrepreneurial gap? Because the money people are doing their job, but the science people are kind of like still stuck in that bubble. So what are certain kind of traits or things that they can do, you think, that would be able to solve this issue?
Well, I think that it's a matter of mindset as well. In startups, people know that ideas, they don't cost anything, but execution is everything. And then they really innovate and are quick and lean with their process, and they just, they hustle and do everything in order to succeed. And then in academia, it's more closed, and they keep their ideas to themselves, and execution is like such a long-term process, and it's very different. But if you are able to align those goals, because in general the research is serving the same goal, as the entrepreneurs are serving the same goal. It's the aim is to do something, to create new knowledge or to create new solutions to improve this society. So it has to be aligned, and it has to be people who shouldn't be afraid of sharing their ideas, to get feedback from others, from different perspectives, from users, from patients, from investors, from everyone, and be more open, and then execute in a best way that they could. And in deep tech, the faster you are and the leaner you are, others will not catch up, even if you share your ideas, because you have the science backing you up and you're lean in innovation, and that's the way to go.
Any last words from the panelists?
I'm okay.
All right, I think we have concluded this panel. Thanks everyone for joining us.